Today we are going to look at shapes. So we're going to look at how we can create different shapes within processing and how we might combine them together to create something that is a little bit more interesting than just a rectangle. So all images that you kind of see in the world can basically be created by a combination of shapes that get layered on top of each other. So those shapes might be a point, which is just a single instance. It might be a line, a rectangle, an ellipse, whatever that shape is. Sometimes you get pretty complicated shapes, stars, for example. So if we look at this, most of these things are just created with basic shapes. So, and layering. So these are images that students have submitted within the computing program. So the one on the right side with the Space Invaders, that's lots of points to create the stars in the background, and then some squares to add up the shape there. Flags are just layers of rectangles, typically on top of each other, sometimes with an image to create something a bit more complex. So, like, for example, this Croatia one here, the Spanish one has something here, the leaf. These can be created within processing, it's just very intricate. But if we take this one here, it's just a white rectangle with a red rectangle on top, both directions. So when I ask later on for you to like create a 2D image, try and think of a bigger image and break it down into smaller parts, the way that we have there, so that you can create something that's really interesting and a bit more dynamic. So the coordinate system we've already touched upon. I just want to remind you. So this is this is a picture taken from the processing website. And previously you've kind of learned that a coordinate is maybe at the bottom left or in the center, whereas when we're talking about it in terms of processing, that 0, 0 point is at the top left hand corner. Okay, so sometimes people will draw things and actually they draw off the screen because they don't realise that that's the point. So this is how you would draw 4 basic shapes. So a line has an X and a Y position, and then another X and a Y position. And because you've given the command line, it knows to draw a line between point 1, 1 and point 4, 5. And so rectangle, you create an XY position, so that's 1, 1. That's going to be my start point, and then the rectangle has a width and a height. An ellipse is slightly different in that the XY position is in the center, and it then has a width which goes right the way across and a height that goes right the way up and down. So that position 3, 3 is there, it's 4 wide and it's 4 tall, so that's allowed me to create a circle. Triangle goes back to this kind of line concept where I've got an X and Y position, a second X and Y position, and a third X and Y position, and it will draw me lines between each of those points to create a triangle. So this is the basic shape that we're going to use in processing. That's called a primitive shape. Now we can order these things together in order to create layering effects. So on the left, if we draw the rectangle first, then the ellipse goes on top. If we put the ellipse first, then the rectangle will go on top. So all processing is going to do is go down each line of code and draw whatever that says. So if you have a big rectangle and then a tiny ellipse underneath it, it's probably because it drew the ellipse first. So being aware of those ordering means that you're not going to lose those shapes when you create them. And I'll show you in processing what I mean by that at the end. It also plays into the use of colour. So if I have set a colour, that applies to everything that happens after I set that colour. So I've got a rectangle, which is the default white colour. I then create a fill, and then when I draw the ellipse, everything has that black fill 0. On the right hand side, if I do the fill first, then the rectangle is also included. So the metaphor there is like picking up a pen. So if I set the fill to be red, that's me picking up a pen, so that everything I draw is going to be coloured by that pen. In order for me to have a different colour, I have to use the fill function to put that pen down and pick up another one. So using fill strategically will allow you to colour different parts of your image in different colours. So more advanced shapes, so if you master the basic primitive shapes and you want to look for something a bit more complex, you can look for a quad. So a quad is basically a triangle with an extra point. So you can start to build up something slightly more complicated. You might want to have a look at shape as an object. So you can do the create shape function, which will let you add multiple points and vertices. You can also use curves to try and just add something a little bit more interesting. But make sure you're familiar with layering and all of the basic shapes before you attempt to make something a bit more complex. Okay, so if I now get rid of this and I bring processing over, I'll let you see what I mean. So I have here just a void setup, which will happen once, and a void draw. So the first thing to highlight here is if I run it, basic grey background. What if I decide I want a background to have a specific colour? So in this case, let's just go for a red background. So now I've got a red background, it's pretty bright. Let's just put some random numbers in and see what colour comes out. It's always part of the fun. Okay, nice orange shade. Slightly less glaring on your eyes than the red. Okay, now, if I am just drawing a shape, I can put it inside setup because I'm not doing any interaction. This is just happening once. I want to boom, draw the shape and I'm done. So let's draw a rectangle. And I need two things. I need an X and a Y coordinate to start. So I'm going to start it at 50 in and 100 down. And I want my rectangle to be 200 wide and 300 tall. So I'm going to draw a nice kind of tall one like that. And then if I hit run, I get an error. So the error says that it's found a closing curly bracket and I must be missing a semicolon. So where that happens, you can see that this has kind of gone red, so that's a nice hint to let you know where it's happened. And it's just because I don't have a semicolon on the end of the line. So there we have one rectangle. I'm now going to draw a circle. So that ellipse is going to be at 200 along, 200 down, and it's going to be 50 wide and 50 tall. And so it should appear right in front of my rectangle. So this is what I wanted to show you from before. So currently I am setting the size, I then draw the background colour, I draw the rectangle and I draw the ellipse. Now if I just for the moment put that ellipse behind, I'm not going to see it, right? Because it's drawing my ellipse in here and then a rectangle on top. So just being conscious that that's probably going to be something that you will do in the future just as you're drawing lots of shapes together. Okay, so I'm going to set my fill colour to be a kind of grey shade. And all that I'm doing here is, after every time, I'm just recreating that sketch. I'm hitting run, and I'm doing that quite frequently at the beginning because I want to make sure that I'm not going to make any mistakes, so that if I make a mistake, I can kind of deal with that one before I move on to the next one. So I've got a nice grey circle. What I'm going to do now is set my ellipse to be the same colour as the background. And so now I should have a nice orange ellipse. But that ellipse I want, rather than a black border around it, I want a white one. So the command for the outline is the stroke. So if I set stroke to be 255, it should be now white. But it's kind of hard to see, right? It's hard to read that that is a white one. So I want to make that stroke a bit larger. So stroke weight, I'm going to make it 10. So I'm going to make it much bigger. The default is 1, so I'm multiplying by 10. Okay, bingo. So what I have now is I've used the fill colour to set the contained colour. I've set the stroke to set the outside colour. I've set the stroke weight to change the width of it. And I've done all of that inside the setup function so that it only runs once. Now, if I was to move my drawing objects commands into the draw function, what we're going to see is something slightly different. It's not going to look quite the same, because what's going to happen is I'm going to set the size, set the background, and then I'm done with setup, right? Then I'm going to do that draw function, remember, loop, 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 loop. So I'm going to pick my grey fill, I'm going to draw the rectangle, I'm going to pick the orange, set my stroke to be white and set it to be size 10, and then I'm going to draw the ellipse. Now remember, my stroke and my stroke weight are set. When I go back to the top, I'm going to change the fill colour. So I'm still operating with my existing stroke 255 and stroke weight 10. So something interesting is going to happen to that rectangle. That's picked up, that stroke and stroke weight. Now, because it's in the draw function, that's looping 60 frames per second. So that's looping really fast. So what happens is it actually draws one with a thin black line, and then it draws everything else on top. So you just never know that it's going to happen. So you never know what's underneath it. It's just layering, 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 layering. A bit like animation. It's just layers of images, one after the other. So if I want to stick to my original black stroke here, I've got to input it. So probably if I'm in the draw function, I need to input that for every single item that I put in there. So stroke weight was probably 1, because that would be default. And if I run that again, I can see I'm back to where I was. So being aware that when you set a value for whatever it is, stroke, fill, stroke weight, anything, it's going to retain that value until you change it again. And bearing in mind that if you're inside the draw function, it's going to go round and round and round. However, I'm just going to pop it back inside my setup function, because I'm not doing any animation, I'm not doing any movement or interaction, so I can just run that once and let it happen. But as my program gets more complicated, I'm probably going to have to start giving some information about what that contains, so that when I go back to it, I'm like, oh, what was that rectangle for again? Well, was that kind of for a door? Does this look a bit like a door? So to do comments, it's // comment goes here. And so I might put things like door section. Anything that happens, I can add them on to the end. So I can say here that makes a thick line. I can do it as an entire line on its own or at the end. And that is the same as you've seen before in Java. Okay, so now you should be at a stage where I want you to play around with different fills. I want you to play around with different stroke weight, try to create some basic shapes. And then I want you to pick up the task. The task is to create the Android guy. So you know the little Android logo. I want you to create him. To do that, you need to investigate what an arc is. So you're going to have to go to the processing reference library to find that out. And we will discuss it as a group later.